Sam, I'm really sorry, I don't have anything for you to hand out. I did. I printed them all out and I put them there so I wouldn't forget them. And guess what? I forgot them. Well, I thought I'd brought them, but I brought the wrong ones. So that's... Anyway, we are going to turn to this chapter, John chapter 6. Can I just say something about the song we just sang, You, My God, Have Saved My Soul, right? So we talk about the soul, and if you're here and you're not a Christian, you say, well, what's your soul? We know what we've got. We've got a body, right? So that is, we all know that. We've got a mind. We all think. Every single person here thinks. We've got a heart, kind of, because we say about the heart that that's how we feel in terms of our emotions. But our heart's got nothing to do with feeling. In the Bible, it talks about, and we don't really like this so much, bowels, your bowels of mercy. And that's because that's the most sensitive part of your body, and so that's what they were saying, that you feel. But it's not, we don't feel in that way. It's... And we have a soul. Now, what's the soul? And people have this very strange idea. But in the song there, it mentioned God breathed his Spirit upon us. And that's relevant to what we're going to look at in John chapter 6, because Jesus is going to perform a miracle that, as we read about this, we would be inclined to think, that would be wonderful. Imagine if you could take a few wee loaves and some fish and transform that into a multiple. You never need to go to the supermarket again. And it's a material thing. But Jesus uses it to teach us a spiritual lesson. Now, the Bible is not saying that the body is not important, because Jesus guarantees he saves our bodies as well. Those of us who are getting older, someone came to the church this morning. I'm just looking to see if you're here. No, you're not. Good. And you told me that you came because you heard there was a new young minister in Scots Kirk. Well, I was really pleased at that until they said, yeah, but you're old. So I said, mature is the phrase, mature. Yeah, thank you. But it was really interesting, because our bodies are decaying. We feel it, don't you? You do feel it. Maybe, okay, you're very young, Sam's age, that's fine. But once you get past 7 years old, it's downhill from there. And you kind of, our bodies. And you know what? It's a wonderful thing to know that you will have a renewed body. I cannot imagine what this will like. One of the great things for heaven for me is I won't feel tired, ever. And that's just going, how is that possible? Well, it will be possible. And this story tells us some of that. So let's go to verses 1 to 4. You'll see them up there. Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that's the Sea of Tiberias, and a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. Well, just the background to this, to try and understand. Again, this is a real event. It's a real historical event. It really happened. And it's near the Sea of Galilee, which was also called, he puts in here a detail, the Sea of Tiberias, because that was, and you'll notice this throughout the Gospels, Tiberius Caesar was the Caesar of Rome, and they had conquered Israel, and lots of things started getting renamed. So that's what happened. They called him, and they called it the Sea of Tiberias. They changed the name. It's interesting again how that happens, doesn't it? There are lots of places where names get changed. I mean, I don't know what the name of Newcastle was before the white people came here, but it had a name, and then the name gets changed, and names will often get changed. Well, that's what happened with Jesus. We're looking at John chapter 6, and people came because they saw that Jesus had been healing the sick. He also comes on the Passover. And then Jesus goes up on a mountainside, and he sits down with his disciples and teaches them. And that was the way people wouldn't normally stand up teaching. They would sit down teaching, which I think is a great idea, especially as you are getting older as a preacher. It's nice to be able just to sit down and teach, but that's what he did. So, that's the situation. There's Jesus. He's up on a mountainside. He sits down with the disciples. He begins to teach them. And then this happens in verse 5. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming towards him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Jesus answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Okay, so we've got a situation where Jesus is sitting there with his disciples, and there's about 15,000 people. Well, why do we say 15,000? This says the feeding of the 5,000. But it was 5,000 men. And I don't know why, but it's the word that's used specifically for men. Well, where there are men, there are women and children. That's what happens. And so it's reckoned that between 15 and 20,000 people came, and Jesus saw them coming. And Jesus had his disciples there, and he looks to one of them, and he looks to Philip and said, "We're going to have to feed this lot. Where should we buy bread for them to eat?" So we do occasionally hospitality here, first Sunday of Five Alive, and when we do it, we're anticipating there might be 40 or 50 people, and you do that. But supposing there was queues and queues all the way, I imagine Jan or whoever's in charge is just going to be freaking out. How much? Well, how are we going to feed all these people? How are we going to do this? And so Jesus, he asked him a question, and notice what it says. It says that he did it to test him, because he already had in mind what he was going to do. And I love Philip. We all have different personality types. Philip's a mathematician. Philip's a very logical thinker. And he logically thinks, okay, quick calculation, 15,000 people. Even if we could go to Aldi's or whatever, there was no place. In Mark's version of this, we're told there wasn't any place they could buy bread. But even if they could, Philip is looking and saying, it's going to, he says here, the Greek actually says a couple of hundred denarii. And what it means is it was about 9 months' wages of a laborer. So I don't know what a tradie earns, but that would be, let's just say, I don't know, $80,000. So Jesus says to his disciples, and his disciples were not well-off people, has anyone got $80,000? And Philip says, wait a minute, it says half a year's wages, but most people think it's probably about 9 months. For each one to have just a bite. We can't feed these people. So it's a really difficult and impossible situation. And again, I want to just apply this in the context of ourselves. We are asked to do things sometimes that are just impossible. We live in a culture where people say, you can do it, you can do this, you can do that. We are never ever going to come to Christ until we realize, I can't do this. I just can't. We can't do it. And sometimes people come into the church here and they want help. They come during the week and they want help. And sure, we can give $20 or help with a little bit of food and everything. But what they really need, we can't give at one level. But Christ can, which is why we always point to Christ. So let's go on to the next one. That's Philip's question. Now Andrew, he asks a question. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. Here's a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many? So Andrew says, I found some food. But again, it's like me here saying, right, we're going to have food, and by the way, we haven't prepared it, whoever, Jan or whatever, can you just get enough food for us? And everyone's in their pockets, and they go, well, I've got a biscuit that we can split and share amongst everybody here. Well, no one's going to hang around for that, are they? They're just not going to. And when Andrew goes, some people think, oh, Andrew's got more faith than Philip. No, he hasn't, because he asked the question, how far will they go among so many? So he's saying, here's 5 small barley loaves. And these were like scones. That's how you pronounce it, by the way, scones, not scoons or scones or whatever. So these were like scones. They were small things. And it's just a wee boy's packed lunch. When you would go out, did any of this ever happen to you? It happened to me because I grew up on a farm that, my dad was a farm worker, and if I would go out somewhere, my mum would make a packed lunch for me. and the packed lunch would just be a couple of small sandwiches or whatever. And in this case, the fish, the 2 fish, usually when they're pictured, they're pictured kind of like that. But these were like sardines or even anchovies. They were things that you put on the bread to just give it a wee bit of a taste. These weren't big fish. So basically, you've got a school kid's packed lunch, the kind of packed lunch that a child would take to school. And Andrew says, come on, how's that going to really help? So, see what happens. On to verse 10. Jesus said, have the people sit down. There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they'd all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Right, what do we say about this? Did it happen? You will go to some churches, and you know what they'll tell you? They'll say, well, this is a wonderful story, because what Jesus did was, all the people came, but some people had forgotten their lunches. So the ones that hadn't forgotten their lunches were kind of mean, and they kept it. Have you got any food? No, I haven't got any food. And so Jesus gets a little boy to come up, and the little boy gives his food, and everyone thinks, oh, the little boy does that, so we can all give what we've got, and we all share. So they turn it into a kind of moralistic tale about how we should all share what we have. How would that be a miracle? It's not a miracle. You know, even if you've got the most tight-fisted person, it's still not a miracle to get them to share. And I think one of the problems with that kind of thinking is, this is bizarre, but you've actually got people in churches who do my kind of job who don't actually believe what the Bible says and don't believe in the supernatural and don't believe that God can work miracles. And yet they stand up and speak in the name of Christ. There's no question about what happened here. He takes the loaves, and by the way, these loaves, they're barley loaves. And barley loaves, if you read in Exodus and Leviticus, they're the food of the poor, right? This is not avocado and sourdough breakfast, right? This is what the poor people would have. And this boy has this poor people's food. And Jesus takes it, and he does this wonderful thing about breaking bread and handing it out. And it just keeps going. Mark tells us that it was more organized than that. If you had 5,000 people, how would you cope? You wouldn't just say, well, let's just make our way through here. We would probably hire the Knight Stadium or something, and the way they're playing, it won't be much use for anything else. But we would hire it, and then you would organize people. You always need somebody in a church who's very good at organizing, who tells you what to do. That's not me here. But Mark says that they put them into groups of 150s. So they had some groups of 100, some groups of 50. And then they just went around and they distributed it. And they did exactly the same with the fish. Now Andrew had said, they'll only get a bite to eat Philip had said, they'll only get a bite to eat if we spent this huge amount of money. This boy comes and they all had enough to eat. And then Jesus says this, gather the pieces that are left over, let nothing be wasted. I love that little detail, because Jesus says, oh, just leave it for the birds. Gather it up. And when they gathered it up, there were 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. And some people see, and I think rightly, a significance in the number 12, the 12 baskets, the 12 disciples, the 12 tribes of Israel. Jesus is basically saying, I have got more than enough for you. I've got more than enough for you. As I say, it's an extraordinary story. Extraordinary, but true, because Jesus is the Son of God. Now, we've mentioned this about miracles many times. You have to be careful with miracles. You have to be careful when people claim things are miracles. You don't know. We often don't know. But you also have to be very careful that you don't just dismiss the possibility that an almighty God could work miracles. He can, and he does. But it's what he does it with. And I want to come back to these 5 loaves and the 2 fish. Because there's a woman called Elisabeth Elliot, and some of you will have heard of her. Yes? She's a famous missionary. Some dreadful stuff happened to her. Right? Just absolutely awful. I don't even really want to describe it. And if you ever heard her speak, and I've heard her not in person, but if you ever hear her speak, you're just amazed about how somebody who is so abused could be so gracious in so many ways. And so much bad stuff happened to her. And she writes this about this story, and I wanted to read it. It's a fairly lengthy quote, but I just thought it was very, very beautiful, because one of the lessons we learn from this story, one is clearly it shows us who Jesus is, that he is able to do this. That's what John's purpose is. But also in terms of what we offer to God. That the very little that we have. So let me give you the quote and then just say something about it. If the only thing you have to offer is a broken heart, you offer a broken heart. So in a time of grief, the recognition that this is material for sacrifice has been a very great strength for me. Realizing that nothing I have, nothing I am will be refused on the part of Christ, I simply give it to him as the little boy gave Jesus his 5 loaves and 2 fishes, with the same feeling of the disciples when they said, "What's the good of that for such a crowd?" Naturally, in almost anything I offer to Christ, my reaction would be, what is the good of that? The point is, the use he makes of it is none of my business. It is his business. It is his blessing. So this grief, this loss, this suffering, this pain, whatever it is, which at the moment is God's means of testing my faith and bringing me to the recognition of who he is, that is the thing I can offer. I once went to a millionaires conference, a Christian millionaires conference. I'm not sure how many of you here would qualify for that, but since you're Australian, probably most of you if you own your own house. But it was an extraordinary experience, because it had been organized by a missionary organization to basically get money out of rich people. And I hated it. I really hated it. For lots and lots and lots of reasons. I mean, it was so posh. You know, it was just extraordinary at one level. But also because of this. If you're in charge of a Christian organization, or a church like this, and someone comes into the church, and you got nothing, you know, you're almost begging on the street, and someone else comes in who's a millionaire, who's more valuable? The temptation is to think the guy who's the millionaire, because he can give more money and it would help run the church, and then we can reach the poor. And that's what people think. Reach the rich and then you'll get the poor. Jesus does it the other way around. He often reaches the poor. Yes, there were rich people in the New Testament who came to know Christ. And Jesus had some women who followed him who were quite wealthy because they provided for him and the disciples. It's a wonderful thing that they were able to do that. But it was the poor. Now, he told a story about this. He said that there was a widow who went into the temple, and she put in 2 little coins, tiny coins, into the collection plate. We've got a collection box there. It's like you just put in a couple of coins. Do some of you even remember what coins are? Do you know what cash is? No. But she put in, you know, basically she just put in tiny coins. And Jesus said, she gave more than anyone because she gave all that she had. Now, I don't think the church treasurer would think like that, or the temple treasurer. And Judas certainly didn't, because he was the treasurer for the disciples. But we have to take that on board. We have to understand that. Because you might say, I've got nothing to give to Jesus. You know, I'm not that well educated. I don't have a big house. I don't have a lot of money. I can't teach in Sunday school. What can I do? And I think it's one of the most crippling things that the devil does. So I want to tell you about a couple that I knew who came to our church. They made a big, big impact on us. In the church that we had in Scotland, it was nearly all young people who came. And we really struggled to get older people. I know that sounds weird, but we wanted to get older people. And this older couple came along. And they were, I think, in their 70s at the time, or maybe even 80. And they told me why they had come. Because the church they had gone to had said to them, you should probably move on and go to another church because you don't fit our demographic. Which has got to be about as chilling words as you've ever seen. You know? And they were like, and he'd been a pastor and everything. So they came and I went to see them and she said, Dave, we love the church and we want to stay, but what can we do? We can't do anything. You know, you've got Sunday school. We can't teach Sunday school. We can't help with the youth. We can't help with the students. What can we do? And then she'd lost a leg and had a leg amputated. And, you know, they were struggling even in terms of their health. And they lived in this small wee apartment. And I said to them, well, what do you do? And she said, well, we pray. I said, oh, well, first of all, I can't ask for anything better than that. But they were a godly, prayerful couple. I said, look, it was a horrible thing that you were told about not fitting our demographic. I said, you don't fit our demographic. We've got all young people, which is why we need you. We need some older people, and especially we need people who have got your gifts and your love for the Lord. And what they did was they used what they had. They had a small apartment, and they could pray. So you know what they did? They couldn't go out and do things and run things and go out at night and everything else. But they would invite students, we had a lot of students, to their house on a Friday for lunch. And it became such an institution that the students were all desperate to get an invite because of one very simple thing. Whenever you went to Dennis and Elizabeth for lunch, you knew that for the rest of your time in university, they would pray for you every week. And it was a tremendous gift. It was a tremendous gift. So I don't want people to think, right, we've got this church and then there's the guy who owns, I told you, SRE, one of the kids went home and told her parents, there's a Scotsman who owns a church in Hamilton. Well, that's not me. I don't own the church. It's Jesus' church. And what you need to grasp and understand, this is Christ's church. Each of us has different roles. It's like with a music band. The music band plays a lot better if there isn't one person who dominates it all the time. Sorry, I'm not making any accusations or anything, but you know what I mean. That, you know, that's, you work in harmony, you work together. And it's the same in the church. And you say, well, what can I do? Well, you can do a huge amount. So I'll give you just one more example, one more story. A man went to a meeting in the north of Scotland of the Wycliffe Bible translators. And he was so impressed with their plea for missionaries, he went and spoke to them afterwards and said, I would love to help. But what could I do? And they said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, I can't speak. I can't teach. I'm quite shy. They said, well, what do you actually do? He said, well, so tells you how old the story is. He said, I'm a typewriter maintainer. I maintain typewriters. And they laughed. And he said, why are you laughing? They said, at our base in the Philippines, we have 1,000 typewriters. We need someone to maintain them. And that's exactly what he did. He went off and he worked with them for several years, looking after all their equipment. Now, all I'm saying is this. A wee boy, a small boy, takes his little gift and Christ was able to multiply it. You cannot have the excuse of saying, I got nothing, I can give nothing. Because as Eliot says, your nothing plus God is everything. And part of the lesson of this is that we have to believe that God can take the little that we have and he'll use it for his blessing. If I made a confession to you, it'd be this. I look and I think, Lord, how can this work? How can this work? And I'm talking about the church and everything else. What can I do? And God says that that's not the issue. The issue is what he can do with what we give him. So don't hold back from God. Give him your 2 pennies, and you will be amazed at what he does. Let's just go on to the last bit. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. That is, in many ways, absolutely incredible. He does something, they love him, they want him to be, they love him in inverted commas, they want him to make him king because he's the one who gives them bread. And I can say this, that when sometimes people teach in the church, come to Jesus and he will pay your mortgage, come to Jesus and he will heal your sickness, come to Jesus and he will deal with your every problem, that is really wrong. Because that is using Jesus. The missionaries used to speak of rice Christians. And what they meant by that was people, you go to a place and you had a lot of money as a missionary, you come from a Western country, and you gave it to people, or you gave food to people, and people would say they were Christians so they could get what you had. I think of a church that was working, a modern day equivalent of this church that was working in a housing project in Australia, and they had a lot of free meals and lots of people came. And then one day they decided to stop doing that, and all the people who were coming to the church, they stopped coming. Is it wrong to give food? No. It's great to give food. Is it wrong to give food to try and bribe people to come to your church? Absolutely. Of course it is. We give food because it's the right thing to do, not because we're trying to manipulate people. Because here's the deal, people can come and they can take the food, but they may not take Christ. And that's what happened here. They took the bread, then they wanted to make him king. Oh, you're going to be the one who can, you're the prophet, which is like Moses or Elijah, and you're the one who's going to throw out the Romans. And Jesus backed off from them, and he went away up the mountain, and he withdrew by himself. Well, if you look across to verse 32, we'll come to this in a couple of weeks. He says this, "Very truly I tell you, it is not Moses who has given you the bread from heaven, but it is my Father who gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is the bread that comes down from heaven and gives life to the world." "Sir," they said, "always give us this bread." Then Jesus declared, "I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me will never go hungry, and whoever believes in me will never be thirsty." You come here, we give you food. Tomorrow you're going to be hungry. It's going to help. As I say, it's not wrong to give food. Very happy to go and receive food from people. But tomorrow you're going to be hungry. And here's the thing, in this world, whatever anyone gives you can fade, and tomorrow you're going to be hungry, or tomorrow you're going to be thirsty. But you come to Christ, and you will never hunger, and you will never thirst. That's not saying you never physically hunger, you never physically thirst. It's not saying you won't have troubles and difficulties, but it is saying that he has an infinite resource. If you won the lottery, I hope you don't play the lottery, but if you won the lottery and you got $1 million or $10 million, you think that's a lot of money, but it will run out. It doesn't keep renewing. When you come to know Jesus, you've won the lottery many times over. Forever. It despairs when I go across to the newsagent across the street and I see people with very little money queuing up and paying $50 or even $100 to get all the lottery tickets. I feel like, don't stop it, you waste your money. And come to the church, not because we're seeking your money, but because we've got something so much better to give you. The people didn't get it. They didn't grasp it. They didn't understand. They were just looking for bread and sardines. Jesus is saying to them, I've got something much, much more. Bread of heaven. You know the great Welsh song they sing at the rugby? You know the reason they sing it at the rugby? It was out of the revival in Wales. And I'm not going to sing it, but the words are, bread of heaven, feed me till I want no more. Feed me till I want no more. When you come to Christ, you have absolutely everything. And that's why we keep on teaching about Christ. And that is our longing, that you would come to know Christ. And the poorest person, the least intelligent, the most intelligent, the richest, the loneliest, the person with the biggest, it doesn't matter. It's for everyone to come to Christ. Now, if you've got questions about that or comments about it at all, please feel free. We put some of the question thing up there just now.
I trust in